Yeah. Hi, my name is Erik, and I'm presenting to you about privacy and performance improvements for these transport protocols. And please interrupt me anytime you have a question or have an important remark. So, but I think in the end there will be also time to discuss in more detail. So the basic motivation for faster connections, first of all, it's interesting for online service operator to have faster connections. Like Google is reporting that an improved page loading time is also increasing their revenue. And also there are some studies on the web user experience, and they show that the quality of the user experience improves when page load faster. I think we can understand that. And better privacy protections, I think that first of all, if we are observed by a network-based attackers, by an observer in the network, we do not necessarily assume that this attacker does not have our consent to interfere with our privacy. So these transport protocols should protect us against this attacker. And furthermore, as a personal opinion, I think transport protocols should not provide tracking opportunities, because for legitimate tracking we have HTTP cookies or other mechanisms, and why shall we have them in these transport protocols? So mainly I'm talking about the traditional HTTPS stack using TLS and TCP. But as some of you might know, the modern HTTPS stack will use the QUIC protocol, which is somehow a merging of the TCP, TLS, and HTTP2. Yeah, and those, I'm also focusing on that protocol. So what is my attacker model? I assume that the attacker only investigates this protocol which I'm looking at to learn the client's identity, and the attacker is able to conduct passive and active attacks. However, the attacker cannot compromise the client's endpoint and cannot break cryptography. Thus, you can imagine the attacker to be an online service provider or an internet service provider in the case of a network-based observer. So, and yeah?
You say the adversary cannot learn the client's identity. What is the client's identity?
The client's identity is...
Is it the IP address or is it something else?
An identifier for the client which he keeps across several connections.
So persistent, a pseudonym.
Yeah, something, yeah. So, and for this talk we require to introduce TLS session resumption. And TLS session resumption is a performance optimization in TLS. And after you have a first full connection establishment, a full handshake, you can in a future connection have an abbreviated connection establishment, which can save a round trip time, but usually has significant performance improvements, as you don't need to apply these public key cryptography to validate the client's identity, the server's identity. And this is a mechanism which is really popular on the internet. Like almost every browser supports it, and almost every website supports it. And large online service providers report that half of their connections uses TLS session resumption. So, and another thing which I want to introduce before I start with my contribution to the future or other things is to introduce the token-based source address validation scheme. This is used by TCP Fast Open and the QUIC protocol, and they issue, here we have also a first full handshake and afterwards an abbreviated connection establishment. And then during the full handshake, the server issues a token. And this token contains, or this token is encrypted, and only the server itself can also consume this token. And this token contains information about the client's IP address or public visible IP address. And then when this is issued over or in the first connection, and the client caches it, and upon the second connection, the server will use this token to compare the claimed client address with the address within that token. So it does an source address validation of the client without having an additional round trip time, which would be usually used during a challenge response mechanism. So let's start with the privacy part of this talk. Basically, user identification is feasible if the client caches identifying information across several connections. And the mechanisms I will show you in this talk, they do not rely on IP addresses, HTTP cookies, or browser fingerprinting. They solely rely on the mechanism within these transport protocols. And all of them allow third-party trackers to identify users across several websites. Like there, for example, Alice visiting Wikipedia, Al Jazeera, or BBC.com. So the first mechanism is tracking via TCP Fast Open cookies. The TCP Fast Open protocol was standardized in 2014 and is supported by Chrome, Microsoft Edge, and Firefox. And it uses a cookie or token for the address validation of the client. And the client reuses this token when he speaks to the same server and the same port. So the main findings on this is that basically the TCP is implemented in the cache of the client, and this is a client or this like a tracking mechanism implemented in the kernel of the client, and it allows unrestricted tracking periods because there's no mechanism to expire these cookies. And I would say that this is from a privacy perspective a severe finding.
Is this a problem of the protocol or the browser that is not clearing the cookie?
Protocol of the kernel, a problem of the kernel or of the protocol. I think first of all, a tracking mechanism should not be stored in the kernel. Okay. And then we have the problem that if the browser switches to private browsing mode, then he sees still the same cache, because the cache is not controlled by the browser, it's controlled by the kernel. And if we restart the browser, the cache is still the same. And if we use different browsers, we still see the same cookie. The browser has no control over this, and this is a severe privacy problem. And as a countermeasure to this paper, Mozilla stopped using the TCP Fast Open protocol within all branches of Firefox. And Microsoft Edge stopped using TCP Fast Open protocol, at least in the private browsing mode of the Edge browser. So I think, that's good that they stopped that. Then tracking via TLS session resumption. This the TLS session resumption is included in all SSL TLS versions up to TLS 1.3, and basically everybody supports TLS session resumption. And it's a performance optimization as introduced. And the main findings here is that browsers, yes, they limit feasible tracking periods, but in the case of Firefox, they limited the feasible tracking periods to 2 days. So you visit or you establish a connection to a server, and when you revisit that connection within these 2 days, you can be tracked. However, in this paper related to the slide, we also showed a prolongation attack against this mechanism. So basically, if you provide a TLS resumption ticket, and then within these 2 days provide a new TLS resumption ticket, the old one gets overwritten, and you extend the period, the tracking period of the client. And this then based on DNS traffic, we analyzed this and found that I think for 60% of the users, we have unrestricted tracking periods. For at least for websites or the host names they visit very frequently. However, this tracking mechanism is restricted by restarts of the browser, or emptying the TLS cache, which limits the tracking mechanism. However,
who can conduct this attack? Third parties in the page?
Yeah, the third parties in the page, but also first parties. Basically, everybody, every server which we are contacting via TLS connection.
But you say that. So I go to the website.
Yeah.
I get a cookie for 2 days. This token for 2
Yeah.
days. I do not go back to that website in 2 days, but somebody is able to extend the validity. How?
No, if you go back after 47 hours,
Yeah.
and then you get, and there's also an update mechanism of the token, and then you can extend the tracking period. Okay. Because then you have, let's say, an intermediate session, and then you can link these both sessions, and then you have another session there, and then you can again link these both sessions. Yeah.
I have a question.
Yeah.
This token is going to be different for each IP connection, and so you require
TLS session resumption?
No, I was talking about
TCP.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So you need to have the websites in the same IP.
Sometimes. I go back to that slide. Okay, the client checks on the IP address of itself and the IP address of the remote site or of the server. And to track, to track via that mechanism, the site needs to be served by the same IP address, physical IP address.
So it would be like a CDN that has the same IP, and
then you can also track across multiple virtual hosts. And let's say you have one CDN which hosting 10,000 websites, and then you can directly as that physical IP address, you can directly track across all these websites. Yeah, But what I actually thought that you asked, and which why I said partially, is that the tracking mechanism also depends on the client's IP address. Oh. However, usually in a home network, if you have a static IP address assigned according to your MAC address. So even if your publicly visible IP address changes, the IP address as the client sees it remains the same.
Yeah.
So and then it still works. But if the client changes its network connection to some other IP address, then the tracking mechanism does not work. But there's a paper to it. So yeah. Then the QUIC address validation tokens. So now we have to differentiate between Google QUIC and IETF QUIC. And this mechanism affects both QUIC versions. And Google QUIC was the earlier version, and IETF QUIC is now the version which is going to be standardized, and they have a different cryptographic connection establishment. And right now, this Google QUIC is deployed by by the Chrome browser, which basically represents 60% of the browser market share. So quite a lot of clients are using this, and the token here, the address validation token, works pretty much this same way like in the TCP Fast Open. However, it's not bound to the IP addresses. It's bound to the domain name of the server. So yeah, and here we found that basically we have also an unlimited tracking period for however, not clients, not network-based attackers can do tracking. Only the online service provider can do the tracking in this case. Because QUIC is by default TLS, or by default uses end-to-end encryption. And this token for future connections is distributed via an encrypted connection. Yeah. And QUIC uses single-use tokens. Thus, it protects against network-based attackers or tracking by network-based attackers. And as a consequence, or as a countermeasure to our reporting, then Google Chrome announced that they restrict the tracking periods to 1 week instead of unlimited tracking periods. However, I'm not convinced that this is a meaningful countermeasure. So the QUIC protocol, well, the QUIC protocol has also another tracking mechanism included, which uses the server config. This protocol, you can imagine, has a public or the server announces a public key, and the client caches this public key and later on reconnects by encrypting towards this public key. So the connection establishment differs from what we know from TLS. However, if the client now caches this public key across several connections, there's an identifier associated to each public key, or exactly to each server config. And if if each client would use an unique or a different server config, this is also an attack vector for user tracking. It also allows unlimited tracking periods. And if the server is tracking via this mechanism, then also network-based attackers are able to link the client across multiple sessions. So it's not only the server who can track the client, but also, let's say, ISPs or network-based attackers. And yeah.
Sorry, the server config, you mentioned it's a service public key, so it's the asymmetric public key.
Yeah.
It seems quite infeasible that the service provider is going to generate on the fly a new public-private key per user for a TLS session. No?
Can generate them anytime and cache them and then just distributes them. I think it's. I'm not saying that this is in practice done. But I'm just saying, okay, if we have this design, then it's a problem. And especially the server config has a field config identifier. There you don't have to change or generate a totally new public key. You only change the identifier of the key, and if you can match that later on to the right public key, then it's fine. So it's
we have a free-form text field. That's something else. Like, it seems very infeasible that you would generate and certify public-private key pair per user. The overhead is just enormous. I mean, I don't see any service providers.
But I think that there is the option to have, let's say, let's encrypt for some random subdomains on the fly.
Absolutely. I mean, but it still takes. I mean, the point of this is to optimize the connection, and I mean that would add significant overhead to every connection.
Yeah.
So that would be surprising. But if there's any free-form text field in that server config, that's something else.
Yeah. And I'm not claiming that this tracking mechanism is actively exploited, especially this one. However, it's a pity of the protocol design that it is in there, and so we need to be aware of it to improve it. And the response of Chrome was that they anyway intend to transition from GQUIC to IETF QUIC. IETF QUIC uses TLS 1.3 connection establishment, and so they don't have this problem after that transition. So now I'm pointing out some future work which I think are worth looking at, and if everybody or anybody is interested in working on this together with me, just feel free to contact me. So one thing, connection-oriented DNS, that I think is something we will see more often in the future. That is DNS over HTTPS, DNS over TLS, basically, connection-oriented DNS or connection-oriented encrypted DNS. And it makes use of TLS session resumption and sometimes TCP Fast Open. And I think an interesting research question would be to investigate the implementations of these DNS or connection-oriented DNS to find out the defaults for feasible tracking periods. And we at the University of Hamburg have also some DNS traffic data set to do also some evaluation, which is a little bit more real world than, let's say, a simulated DNS traffic set. Yeah. Then another future work in the field of privacy is actually at the moment we have the TLS, or just talking about TLS 1.3, not to about any other TLS versions. So we have the performance optimizations of session resumption, but we don't have something else. And session resumption always allows client identification or linking of clients across several sessions. However, it is basically feasible to have client unlinkability and also a better performance than the full TLS handshake. For example, we could use some hybrid crypto systems. For example, I establish a connection with the TLS server, and the TLS server announces a public key, which he provides me. And then I can encrypt a symmetric key towards this server with its public key. And then I can send in the subsequent connection establishment this symmetric key encrypted with the public key, and also some early data which I encrypted with the public key, with the symmetric key. So I think that might be worth looking at, and the research questions are certainly a performance evaluation, and I'm quite convinced that we can achieve a stateless design on this approach, so that the server does not keep the state of each connection which it saw, and there's still the problem that if the server is rotating its public keys very often, then this can reduce the anonymity sets of the clients, or let's say only a few clients, or each issued public key to a specific client, or if there are a unique linking between the client and the ISP, then the anonymity set is only one, and it's easily to identify the client. And if so we need a mechanism to ensure that the server is not distributing too many of these public keys. And I imagine that it would be feasible to do something with transparency locks, if you are familiar with that concept. But that is future work. So then another thing, privacy-friendly address validation tokens, like the issue of address validation. We have it in several, or TCP Fast Open, and also the QUIC protocol. And here's the idea of using some sort of blinding mechanisms, like blind signatures, or some mechanism of the anonymous eCache, and to have or to generate these tokens. However, these tokens then cannot include the client's IP address of the previous session. So the server also is not able to authenticate or validate the client's IP address. The server would only validate that the client has previously successfully connected to the server. However, with respect to denial of service mitigation, that is already better than having the full round trip, or one can also implement some sort of threshold scheme to have for certain connections, to a certain and when the server feels that it is facing a denial of service attack, then it can stop accepting these tokens generated this way. So let's talk about performance optimizations for transport protocols. And here, first of all, I want to point out that visiting a website requires on average 20 TLS connections, and the delay incurred by this connection establishment is quite significant in comparison to the time required to load the content of that website, or to load these resources. So it would be a nice thing to reduce this overhead, and an especially impactful approach of reducing this overhead is to reduce the number of required round trips during the connection establishment. So here, one thing I did is the TCP Fast Open privacy protocol, and it tackles a problem that the TCP Fast Open protocol binds the token to a specific IP address, and this TCP Fast Open privacy protocol starts or binds the token to a host name. So it's cross-layer optimization. It also has other privacy benefits to it. However, it also has a performance improvement to it because today, if you visit a website and afterwards revisit the website, you have about a chance of 40% to get your second visit of the website served from a different IP address. And in these cases, the TCP Fast Open approach would always fail. And by design, our approach does not fail in these situations. And yeah, this provides some significant savings. For example, if you have a round trip time of 60 milliseconds, which is like not normal for today's LTE connections, you have savings of on average 38 milliseconds per connection establishment for the first revisit.
Any idea why they were replying from different IPs? Load balancing, or is it? Do you know why they were replying from different IPs?
That is load balancing across several physical systems.
Okay.
Yeah, but yeah, they quite heavily use DNS round robin or the different IP addresses to do it. But there are also different load balancing approaches which would use always the same IP address, yes, like Anycast. Or yeah, but this mechanism is quite popular. So then another performance improvement for TLS. Therefore, imagine you are visiting the site www.example.com, which also loads a resource from static.example.com. In this case, your browser will conduct 2 TLS connection establishments, one to each domain name. And I thought that is quite unnecessary if these 2 domain names are actually more or less one entity, if they have a high trust level to each other. And for example, if they share the same server certificate. And so there's the idea of having session resumption across host names. And this is something we evaluated for the Alexa Top 1000 domains and found that on average this converts 60% of the full connection establishment to performance optimized session resumptions, which is a nice result because this can reduce the time for to establish all the TLS sessions required to load a specific website by up to 30%. And with respect to the CPU time, which is also, let's say, an indicator of the energy resumption of the server, this allows us to save 44% of the CPU time. And afterwards, I also proposed this mechanism to the IETF and presented it at the TLS working group. And now there's also a draft, an internet draft on this. And yeah, Google also announced that they are interested in implementing this in the Chrome browser. And hopefully we will see that in the future. Yeah.
For the evaluation, you look at the certificates of the top 1000?
We looked at the certificates and we looked at feasible session resumptions.
Okay, and so in practice today, this means that 60% of the top 1000 Alexa websites, they have one certificate for all.
Okay. Within the okay, you load a website, and then you have a domain tree. Let's say all the third parties, or we only looked in the context of a single website and all the resources attached to this website and all the TLS connection required to retrieve that website. Like on average, these are about 20 TLS connections involved for each website, and then
that's with HTTP 1, right? With HTTP 2, this would be much fewer connections, right?
For connection reuse,
Without connection, I mean, these 20 TLS connections that you talk about is for all the resources on the site, right?
No, you need 20 connections to 20 different host names.
Okay.
You can also have multiple TLS connections to the same host names, but this is something we excluded. You can have, or you need to have 20 TLS connections to different host names.
So that's tracking websites, CDNs, etc.
For an average website.
In that case, there wouldn't really be a trust relationship between them, right? I mean, like in how many of these cases would there actually be a trust relationship that they would be in the same certificate?
Not necessarily all of them are together in one certificate, but like example.com and static.example.com, there it's somehow clear, and maybe if you have tracker 1 and another tracker 2, and maybe they also have a trust relationship. And so we looked at each certificate which we retrieved and had a look whether this certificate also includes domain names, other domain names which within the set of this website.
I think the point is that a lot of them are subdomains.
Yeah.
And that those obviously have a relationship.
Yeah, and some TLS certificates include hundreds of domain names for which they are valid, or wildcard certificates or whatever. So, yeah.
Now that's a bit confused.
Yeah, but there's a paper out on that. So, and pretty much the same mechanism we can also apply on the address validation. So that is something. So we share the address validation across host names that trust each other, and here we evaluate, or in that paper we evaluated trust in respect to the TLS certificate, and afterwards, as a contribution, we proposed this to the QUIC working group of the IETF, and they want to release a standard during this year, and said, okay, for now it's a bit tight, but when the QUIC version 2 will be released, then we would like to include this as a feature there. So, but then additional work on this, then I thought, okay, within the context of address validation, it's not necessary to have TLS trust, to trust the confidentiality of my connection with respect to the confidentiality of my connection. I also trust, for example, my DNS resolver, or I don't trust Google DNS if they say, okay, this client has that IP address, I would agree to it, and maybe do not a strict checking of that claimed IP address of the client if it matches the thing which Google in that case tells me what the IP address of this client is. So this approach now broadens the trust or the sharing of address validation, not within the trust group of a TLS certificate, but basically I can tell any QUIC server, or any QUIC server or any DNS server or any entity, if you issue address validation tokens, then I'm willing to trust them. And if I observe that they misbehave or abuse that trust, then I can also easily revoke the trust by revoking the secret which I share with them, or by not accepting the tokens which the client presents me from these clients.
In this case, the token is given by the resolver?
By the resolver or by other websites. For example, a website could include a token for all the other resources which are required to retrieve the website. So it just issues these tokens, and the client can load the content of the website faster.
Is it important in this case that the connection with the resolver is encrypted?
No.
Okay.
So future work with respect to performance optimization. This is a paper I'm already writing, and on the next slide you will also see some early results from this work. And basically I think DNS is some sort of performance problem, and I would like to optimize also DNS. And however, I think it's difficult to change the DNS protocol. And sometimes it's also difficult to change the QUIC protocol, even if it's new. So I want to leave these both protocols as they are. And I also don't want to do IP address spoofing. And I want to have end-to-end encryption. These are, let's say, my requirements. And now I say, okay, my ISP is providing me a DNS service. And now my ISP can also provide me a QUIC SOCKS proxy, which is the novel thing I'm introducing here. And there you find the connection establishment between the client and the server, and it uses this proxy. And instead of doing it now an advanced DNS lookup, the client directly sends its client hello without knowing the DNS or the IP address of the server. And it sends it towards the proxy. The proxy is co-located with the DNS resolver, has a very fast connection to look up the IP address, and then forwards this client hello towards the server. In some cases, depending on the QUIC server, there might be a stateless retry, which uses this token to validate the IP address. And then afterwards, the server responds, and the proxy forwards this response to the client, and the connection is successfully established. So, however, if, certainly or maybe the ISP would not like to have a proxy for, let's say, Netflix streams which have or consume a lot of bandwidth. So after this connection is established that way, and then going back that way, QUIC provides a feature which is called connection migration. So unlike TCP, QUIC allows to change the IP address on an established connection. And now the client migrates the connection towards the direct path between the server and the client. And this provides performance improvements always when the RTT, or the round trip time between this server, this round trip time, is shorter than the round trip time down here, the direct round trip time. And now quite often the ISP provided DNS resolver is further into the core network of the internet than the client, which is quite remote. imagine at the moment that there are quite a lot of plans for low Earth orbit satellite internet access, which, for example, by SpaceX or Telsat, which want to send a couple of thousand of satellites during the next few years to provide broadband internet access in Africa or wherever or around the globe. And there we have exactly a situation that the DNS provider or the ISP provided DNS resolver is the signal needs to travel to the satellite, and from the satellite down to the ground station, where might be also the ISP provided DNS server and the QUIC proxy. So the last mile latency of the client is very high, or quite significant, call it that way. So to access a little bit, does this make sense, or does this not make sense to deploy this? We looked at, or we used some RIPE Atlas nodes. I'm not sure whether you know them. Any person can apply for some measurement probes or nodes and deploy them in their network, and the RIPE is distributing them but they try to distribute them across different ISPs and get a broad spectrum of clients. And we tested this with 800 RIPE Atlas nodes in Germany. And here we find these two plots are related to the connection establishment without a stateless retry, and these two plots using a stateless retry. This two. And we see quite significant performance improvements, especially for the clients with a very high latency. For example, here we see that let's say 2-3% of the clients require more than 200 milliseconds to establish their connections. However, using our protocol, they are completed, let's say, at 80 milliseconds. So this, and also for shorter latencies, we still have some significant performance improvements. However, for clients with very low latencies, there's only a small benefit to it. So I think that is something which might sound a little bit very new, but I think it's worth at least considering it. So, and another thing which I'm thinking about is resolverless DNS. That does not mean that there will be no DNS resolver afterwards, but possibly there will be less DNS resolver afterwards. So imagine, as I told you, the DNS is quite a performance and a privacy problem, because DNS operators, they aggregate a lot of behavioral statistics about a user, which sites the user's visiting, and you always have that additional delay with the DNS lookup. So the performance improvement would be to have the website server also providing you DNS records. So for example, you are visiting example.com, and example.com also provides you a DNS record for static.example.com. And so the DNS record would be identical with the DNS record you would receive from your DNS resolver. So you save that additional delay overhead, and you have privacy benefits to it. Yeah, and there are some issues why this is not yet adopted, or why people struggled with adopting it, and I think actually they can be solved. For example, there was the issue whether this is integrating well with today's CDN system, content delivery networks. And there, in the CDN systems, we have eDNS, client subnet, this DNS extension, which allows to retrieve specific DNS records corresponding to a specific client IP address. So that a client is more likely to get served content from a CDN node in the proximity of the client. So, and I think that can be solved. And there were also some issues about trusting these DNS records of arbitrary websites, or whether it's better to have a DNS resolver to trust. I think today's internet is moving towards an encrypted ecosystem. Nowadays, already 80% of the HTTP requests are encrypted. So in the end, we have authentication of the server via TLS. So I think maybe it's not necessary to have an implementation within DNS to do that. And anyway, there exists maybe DNSSEC for this purpose. However, it's not really in a good shape.
5 minutes to 3.
Yeah, and it's not in a good shape. So it's not feasible to deploy that in this context. So maybe one does only want to restrict this approach for encrypted requests. Yeah. So my conclusion is pretty short. Let's get ready to do something. Let's make the web faster, and let's make transport protocols privacy friendly. Yeah, thank you for your attention.